We're now going to take a few moments to talk about how we felt that interview went, what went well, what could potentially be improved. So the first thing I would like to hear some thoughts on is what stood out to you as especially positive about that interview, about Lisa's responses. What are some things that stood out? What stood out to you?
So one of the things that I've been learning is hand gestures, especially in the virtual environment. I tend to use a lot of hand gestures, and I noticed that Lisa was doing the same. And I think it's a good thing, but I would like to hear some feedback on the pros and the cons, or should we be using hand gestures, or just, I mean, you're not using hand gestures right now, and it looks perfectly fine. So I'd just like to hear some feedback.
Janelle, you have some thoughts on that?
I agree with your assessment. It was a fantastic interview. I think she's landing the job. I also agree that hand gestures are important. And sometimes too many hand gestures can get distracting. The other point I want to make was that there were a lot of and so's and just so's and ands. A lot of the sentences went on and on. There weren't no periods. That's not true in all cases. And in fact, I think you probably had more situations where you did not do that. But as a Toastmaster, those things stick out. Maybe not so much to the interviewer, but as a Toastmaster, definitely pick that up. Awesome job, though.
I'd like to dive back a question about hand gestures.
Yes, please do, George.
One of the real issues that happens, especially in this format, is that a lot of times our hands are moving someplace that's off screen. So the challenge is to bring the gesture into the into the viewing area. I know that hand gestures make a big difference, and facial expression makes a big difference, but the challenge is to keep it so it's not a distraction off screen, because now you know my hands must be doing something off screen, but you don't have a clue. So my recommendation is quality gestures that are visible, fully visible to the viewing audience.
And I would add to that too, George, be aware of how your software that you're using is going to make those look. Like if I do gestures with my background blurred, it can be a little distracting. So if I know I'm someone who gestures a lot, I might not blur my background during the interview, for example. And it's hard when you're speaking off the cuff. You sometimes don't always know what your hands are doing, but the more purposeful you can make your gestures just in general when you're communicating, the better. Like if you're counting out things that you've done, that's a great time to use a gesture because it helps you keep track of what you've covered, and it shows that the person you're talking to that you have multiple things you want to talk about. So those would be my tips. Make sure that your gestures aren't distracting, and the more meaningful you can make them just in general, the better.
I did notice that when you're using the blurry background, you look like you could be a candidate for that. What's that new TV show, Ghost?
Oh, I haven't seen that.
Oh. But you had ghostly gestures.
Any other comments on gestures?
Yeah. One thing you can do to help make those gestures more visible is, of course, sitting back and adjusting so that you present more of yourself on the screen. However, like Floyd said, you want to make sure you still, lean forward and you don't want to look like you're all the way back, but so that you're upright, but say something like this, and your gestures become more visible. And then when you lean in, obviously it's obvious to the interviewer. So it still accomplishes that engagement. If you are prone to using your hand gestures and it's hard to cut that down, I would suggest moving back a little so they don't go off camera all the time. That's my.
Yeah, excellent.
I might add something. When you talk about leaning in and when Floyd did, sometimes people have nervous mannerisms, or maybe they're just observed that they look that way, that possibly you're moving back and forth. Maybe you would lean in, or it might be a little distracting. Maybe you're just looking closer at something, but be careful that you're not moving back and forth when you're doing that type of engaging behavior.
Yeah, and practicing like we're doing today can really help with that, because then somebody else can tell you if your motions were distracting or if they added emphasis like you want. Other things that stood out in that interview, especially with the questions themselves. David, go ahead. What stood out to you?
Thanks, Jessica, and thanks, Linda and Lisa, for doing that. I just want to make a comment on, so I saw, it seemed like in the beginning, so it seemed like interviews are about the rhythm. It's about a conversation. So very similar to just any normal conversation, and the pauses, the getting a good rhythm, and you're trying to show that you mesh well with them, with the other person. And it seemed like in the beginning it was a little slower, like any normal type of, maybe a beginning of any interview or conversation. And then it really picked up, and the rhythm really got going well. And I love that story at the end from you, Lisa, the showing the like very specific story that Kim Kardashian, and you're thinking outside the box. I mean, there's some things that you can plan for and some you can't, but it's really showing what, like you said in the past, what value you bring to the company. And I think just catching your rhythm. I think for me, I'm more of a internal type of a person, and I think Floyd or somebody or George maybe mentioned about like getting a good pause, thinking about their question. It's fine, or repeating what they say to give you a little more time to think about it. Because I think in the past, my problems was too long of a pause, and it became a slightly awkward because I'm thinking and I'm in my head, and so it's trying to get that good rhythm, that go back and forth of a good conversation. And I think that went really well, and I'd say I would hire you, Lisa. I think you did great, and so that's all I had. Thanks, Jessica.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, David. I also noticed that you used the technique of repeating part of the question to give yourself a little more time to think, which is really good because that, first of all, verifies that you heard and understood the question, and it does also give you that extra time to think. I have also seen people that I have interviewed, if they need more time to think, they just tell me that. And I always appreciate that, because then I know that they're thinking, and I know that I shouldn't rush them because they just need a few more moments to gather their thoughts. So if you need a little more time to think through your answer, I would encourage just telling the interviewer that, saying, I need a few moments to collect my thoughts on that, because I've always appreciated that when I've interviewed people and they've been honest about that. Janelle, did you have another observation to share?
Yeah. Okay. One more thing is, and George touched on this, but it's really important in the virtual environment that you use a lot of facial expression, or at least enough facial expression to show that you are engaged and to make that contact. And remember that you did a good job on this, a really good job. Remember that the camera is your eye contact. You don't have notes for this. You have no reason to look elsewhere, really, other than it's going to be tempting to watch the interviewer. Always remember the camera is where you want to be looking. And that's for other people, because you did a fantastic job.
Excellent. Thank you, Janelle. Floyd, something you'd like to share?
Yeah, I echoing somewhat what Janelle said there. One of the things you can do if you've practiced, you have certain strengths that you want to be sure that you point out during your interview, because you've done your research, you know what the company is all about, you know where you want to go. make yourself some little Post-it notes and stick it up on the sides of your computer or above that, because you don't have to see everything, you know. You can put your Post-it notes right there where you can see it. I need to say this. I need to remember this. And you know they're going to ask you, give me an example of a time when you had to make a difficult decision. That's probably one you'll get asked. So put your little difficult decision and just make yourself a couple words that gets your mind, but you're looking straight ahead. You're looking in the camera, but your whole notes are across the top there and you can see it. It's just a little way of cheating to help yourself.
Yes, that's excellent. Yes, there's nothing wrong with having some notes of key things you want to make sure you bring up. And I know when I have interviewed others, I have often, my penultimate, my second to last question is often, is there anything else you want to share that hasn't come up? And so if they do ask you that, that's a good opportunity to bring up any of those additional Post-it notes that you didn't get to. All right, any last questions that anyone has about, did you have something, Floyd?
And just one thing too, I noticed that just to re-emphasize, and I didn't mention it in mine when I was talking, is Lisa remembered to thank her for the interview at the end. Always remember to thank them for the interview. And that was something we had not mentioned, but I wanted to point out she did do that.
Yes, very good. And I'll just make a quick observation too. Janelle kind of touched on this. I noticed some of your answers were longer than others. So I do think there was an opportunity to be a little bit more concise, but you were certainly more concise than some interviews that I have been a part of. So that was my observation, that it could be more concise, but it wasn't outrageously long, your answers. Any other questions or observations? Anything you saw that you are wondering if that might be good, or did you have one?
My situations lately have been either phone interviews or face-to-face interviews at the site. And in my experience, the phone interviews end up being a screening instead of a real interview or an interview from the recruiter. And then when I ask the question, about next steps or that type of thing, it's like, that's up to the manager. And then I either don't hear something or I get a letter saying we've gone other routes, so to speak. Is that, like, I don't want to call it a tactic, but is that something that is a way for a smaller company to interview everybody that they get as an application so they can really screen who is the quality person? I don't know the background behind that.
Right. I see Floyd nodding. I don't have experience at small companies specifically, but I would say that if you can get any sort of contact to follow up with in those situations, that's good, because it's really good if they don't get back to you within, say, a week, that you reach out to them and ask for the status. So I can't speak to why they do that exactly, but the step that you can take is to try to get some sort of contact information and follow up with them about a week later if you don't hear anything more. Do others have?
Usually it's like the next day.
So one of the things that we need to remember, and this is something that I didn't talk about, is most times your interviews need to go through someone who's doing the pre-screening for the person, the supervisor who's going to do the hiring, or you're going through an HR manager. And the thing you need to remember with your HR managers, if you're applying for a technical job or applying for a job that is some special skill, you need to be sure that you put your skills in words that the HR person can understand. They won't necessarily know all the technical terms for everything. So you have to put it, as I call it, layman's terms.
Well, the jobs that I am applying for are middle level, but because I haven't been in the don't have immediate experience in the last 6 years, even though all my relevant experience can play into my next office job?
Let me make a suggestion. Ask your sister to give you my contact information and give me a call.
Okay.
I can help you with some of that.
Excellent. Thank you, Floy. And I see a couple people with hands raised still, but I do want to make sure that there is time for us to do our other mock interviews. And that's the breakout rooms that we're about to go into are a great opportunity to get some more specialized practice for anyone who is interested in doing that.